Thank you, Freddie. This is a wonderful exhibition, and it's quite rightly focusing on continuities and coexistence. And later, next month, we're going to have a panel discussion here, which will look at what we can learn from the past about Egypt in the present. And so I thought tonight, I talk about frontiers here, that while we, at the same time as we talk about continuity and coexistence, this was actually a very turbulent period in Egypt. And we need to look at that too, in order to be able to understand some of the turbulence that is going on today, and look at some of these very interesting tensions. Because continuity is fine, but the course of true love never did run smooth. And it certainly didn't always run smoothly in Egypt. There's a lot of talk these days, and ever since the Enlightenment, really, that the religions just can't get on. People get stuck with their beliefs and their views of God, and there's no way that they can never really agree or get on together. But these religions don't exist in isolation. Each religious tradition exists in a kind of dialogue with a transcendent, unspeakable, and indescribable reality, and events on the ground. And the events on the ground very much transform people's thinking. And what's very important to realize is that if there's tension between religions, it's not just that people are driven in at some kind of dogmatic frenzy by theological fervor, or they're in love with their own theology or their dogmatic view of what God is, or what the prophet is, or who Jesus is. There's also a political element too. These faiths all exist in a political climate, and that will inevitably affect the way they experience their faith and experience one another. So I want to have a look at this to prepare the ground, in a way, for our debate next month about current Egypt. I'll be concentrating, though, on the period is covered by the exhibition. Now, the exhibition opens at about the time when the Roman Empire was coming into being, one of the greatest world empires ever. But we need to examine the concept of empire a little bit, and the concept of the pre-modern state. Every single civilization, every single civilized state in whatever part of the world we're talking about, was based on a profound structural injustice. In each civilization, a small aristocracy comprising about 5% of the population managed to gain control of the economy, which of course in the pre-modern period was based on agriculture, a surplus of agricultural produce. The aristocracy, plus their retainers, administrators, soldiers, servants, etc., would forcibly take from the 90% of the population, these peasants who were reduced to serfdom and kept at subsistence level, would take their surplus from them, and force them to live in penury and deprivation. This 90% of the population for over 5,000 years, therefore, lived in a state very little, very close to slavery. And historians tell us that without this iniquitous system, we would probably never have advanced beyond a primitive level, because it created a privileged class who had the leisure to explore the arts and the sciences on which our progress depended. And so that's the context in which these religions, one of the arts and sciences that would come about would be religion as we know it. Nearly all the great sages and prophets were aristocrats. Peasants were not going to be allowed by their overseers to sit down in the fields and do yoga for hours every day. This was the preserve of the aristocrats, though there are some, especially in the Jewish tradition, we hear voices from the other side too sometimes. But there were always prophets, sages, and mystics who cried out against this injustice. And that is very much the context in which the three faiths that we're speaking about tonight, developed in the context of the Roman Empire. Now, the thing about the Roman Empire is it was extremely violent, and yet it was known, it was called the Pax Romana. We're a bit down on empire these days, for obvious reasons. But it's interesting that in the pre-modern world, people looked for a strong empire as the best way of keeping the peace. Because the economy depended upon agriculture, the only way any aristocrat could increase his gross national product was to get more land and more peasants to farm it. So warfare was essential to the economy, to expanding the economy, and aristocrats were always fighting one another, and the people who suffered most were always the peasants, the poor, who got caught in the firing line, as it were. What was needed was a strong empire that would keep these potentially warring aristocracies in check. And that was what the Roman Empire was. Pax Romana it was, but its army was the most efficient killing machine the world had yet seen. And any resistance at all was met with terrific force. The slightest degree of resistance. The cross, the crucified human beings were displayed in every village, town, and province of the Roman Empire as a deterrent to show what happened if you stepped out of line and offended Rome. So that is the context in which these faiths in Egypt were operating. Egypt became part of the empire, and they were all affected by this in very contradictory ways. Religions don't operate as monolithic, wholly unanimous institutions. They contain a huge variety of responses to this. In Judea, as we know, there was continual unrest. Throughout the first century CE, there were constant, mostly non-violent uprisings, demonstrations against Roman power. And one of these non-violent uprisings, these demonstrations, was, of course, Jesus, who preached a kingdom in which rich and poor would sit at the same table, in which all were welcomed. And Galilee in his day was suffering under a massive tax burden, that they were having a double tax burden from both the temple, the Herodian aristocracy, and the Roman Empire. And peasants were being turned off their land and being reduced to vagabondage or brigandage. And Jesus was crucified. We know very little about him in many ways, but he was crucified, probably because of his very provocative entrance into Jerusalem when he was hailed as the Messiah. Liberate us, Son of David, the crowds cried. And then he overturned the money changers' temple. changes tables in the temple, crying that this was a den of thieves. And this wasn't just a plea for a more Protestant spiritual style of worship. For 500 years, the temple had been the center of the imperial administration, and the produce extorted in kind from the people to be conveyed, in this case to Rome, was stored in the temple precincts. So this was a highly politically charged event, and Jesus died this disgraceful death, and his followers saw him. The earliest ideas of resurrection, as we seem to have been, that God had reached into the grave and taken Jesus' filthy, degraded body, broken body, and raised it to the highest heights of heaven. A complete upturning as to what was honorable and what was right and what was holy. And the Jewish unrest continued in Palestine, of course, until the year 70, after the Great Jewish War, when the Romans completely destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed its temple, of which more later. Egypt was more peaceful. In the Roman Empire as a whole, if they weren't rising up, Judaism was religio licita. It was one of the permitted religions of the Roman Empire, and the Romans respected the great antiquity of Judaism and its morality and its great, and so they had great respect for it. But there was still unrest. Because Jews were given certain privileges, this was often resented by the local aristocracies who were smarting under their own lack of independence, and there could be tension, and there was in Alexandria. And when Caligula, in the year 38, 39, said that the Emperor Caligula demanded that he have his image, his statue, erected in the temple in Jerusalem, there were riots in Alexandria. And when, after that had been settled down, and thank goodness Caligula had died before anything could happen, Claudius, the new emperor, sent out Herod Agrippa to be king of the Upper Jordan Valley. He was the first Jew to hold a royal title ever since his grandfather Herod the Great. And he was greeted on his way out to Judea with huge acclaim. In Alexandria, he was greeted as the Messiah. Again, a messianic feeling very strongly there in relatively peaceful Alexandria. There was that. In the diaspora, there was a new militant form of Judaism grew up. It was called Judaismos. It's often translated Judaism, but it had a more precise connotation in the first century. It meant people who were passionate about Judaismos were determined to resist acculturation to the Greco-Roman ethos and determined to hold on to their Jewish identity. They were also determined to preserve the Jewish people and would quell any attempt to stir things up that might cause a riposte from Rome. And one of the most fervent adherents of Judaism was, of course, St. Paul before his conversion. And he says in his letter that he was foremost among the people of Judaismos, and that it was for this that he persecuted the church, the followers of Jesus, because he was afraid that all this talk of a crucified Messiah, a man who had been executed by a Roman governor, would be very dangerous to the Jewish people as a whole. It would be extremely provocative. And he seems to have resorted to some kind of vigilantism and until, of course, his great conversion. But very important, and here we have the continuity, there's they're not starting a new religion here. Until about well into the 2nd century, what we call Christianity now was simply a Jewish movement that followed Jesus as Messiah. And in fact, the word Christianity or Christian occurs only 3 times in the New Testament, and it usually appears on the lips of people who are not members of the Christian churches. So Judaismus was one form of response to Rome, pushing Judaism into a different mode, a perhaps more aggressive mode. Other Jews in the diaspora, in Alexandria particularly, were very much enthralled by the Greco-Roman ethos. And they were modulating their Judaism to express the universality that Rome represented. The Greco-Roman ethos that spanned so many cultures, so many countries and regions. They brought out the universality that was inherent in monotheism, that there was, they said, one God, but in many names. We know him as Yahweh. Other people will know him by a different name. And they said that these Jews are not the only people who have had a law given to them by God. Certainly the Greeks and the Romans thought that their laws, their sacred customs were divinely inspired, and this was to be respected. So that was yet another response to the Roman occupation, to Greco-Roman culture. But there were some that were other responses that were a little more, as let's say, iffy. There was Philo, the great Philo, who spanned the millenniums. He born in the late 1st century BCE. One of the great philosophers, very much, here we have the continuity again, enthralled by Platonism, by the Greco-Roman philosophy. And he founded a wisdom movement, which that's reflected in some of the Apocrypha, a special devotion to Sophia, the divine wisdom, which was an emanation of God. And it was a way of compensating us for subject people to say that we have a wisdom that is superior to that of our oppressors, that of the people who rule us. Another rather more aggressively chauvinist form has been known as Jewish missionary theology. There were some Jews in Alexandria particularly who felt that Judaism would soon rule the world. And Jews would, because of the superiority of their faith, they would found one single world empire, and it would be a democracy. But that did not include the hoi polloi, the common people. These people were very much rather full of themselves and thought they were superior human beings. They venerated divine beings, divine human beings, that they looked at people like Moses and Abraham who'd been divine human beings. Jesus was another one, some of them thought. He'd worked great miracles. And they too were gods in their own way, living, walking gods. And they very much preened themselves on the miracles they worked and that would stun the people into acceptance of Judaism. Now, St. Paul would have problems with members of both the wisdom movement and the Jewish missionary movement in Corinth. His first letters to the Corinthians deals with by this time the wisdom people were saying, if you've got wisdom, and this was a Jewish form, this was a Christian Jewish form of it, spread by a man called Apollos, who probably came from Alexandria, you're completed, you are filled with wisdom, you are a perfected human being. And these people were rather vaunting all their charismatic gifts as status symbols. Now, Paul didn't like that at all. He pointed out that the wisdom of God was not something wonderful and polished. It was the cross, the ugliness of the cross that shocked that it was a scandal and a foolishness to the Gentile world. And in 2 Corinthians, he's dealing with people, the Jewish missionary people, who he called super apostles because of their boasting. And all this is pushing religion, the idea to compensate for being occupied, for being a subject people, can lead to an unhealthy form of religion that stresses the ego. And so there are all these different versions of Judaism that were coming to the fore as a result of Roman occupation. Now, the exhibition shows a lot of wonderful manuscripts of scripture. And one of the people associated with the scriptural revival of this period is, of course, Philo, who we mentioned earlier. He developed a sort of Platonic form of Judaism, of reading the Jewish scriptures, it was called allegory, which in literary Greco-Roman terms meant that you looked beneath the surface and you found a different meaning from what the surface meaning of the text was about. And he wanted, as a Platonist, where you leave the body and strive to become more spiritual, he wanted to get away from the physical nature of Jewish sacrifice and Jewish rituals. And so he allegorized everything to create a more spiritual message. Now, he was one of the first proponents of what was happening was a scriptural revolution in the region. We are so used now to having scriptures as a major way of approaching the divine that we don't realize how absolutely novel that was. In Judaism, we don't really know what a lot of those texts were about, how they were treated, what religious role they had in early Judaism. And certainly in the intertestamental period, a lot of people were very critical about the Torah in the Jewish world. But there was no uniform acceptance of it. And here we have another example of religious disaster, of a political disaster, pushing forward a positive response. After the loss of the temple, Judaism had been a temple religion, devoted to temple ritual. A few people had been interested in the scriptures, but it was a minority pursuit. The rabbis who composed the Talmud took these multifarious scripts, which had been composed for over a millennium, and made this the chief means of approaching the divine. Henceforth, Jews who had lost their temple, they would no longer encounter the divine presence in the temple and ritual. They would encounter it in a sacred text. And they created a form of exegesis called midrash, which took off in a way that Philo's never did, and has became the main way in which Jews interpret their scriptures. And again, in midrash, you are not sticking with the ordinary meaning of the text. Every time in midrash a Jew confronts the text, it will mean something different. And something that the original author would not have thought of. Wilfred Cantwell Smith, the great scholar, said that scripture is not a text, it's an activity. It's a process of interpretation. And Origen, great Christian biblical scholar, 2nd century, 2nd, 3rd century, he took on. Philo. He responded to Philo, to Platonist. He was a great Platonist again, very much open to other traditions. And when he had to leave Alexandria and move to Caesarea, there he was influenced by the rabbis in Palestine, and he developed a form of scripture that was, again, not literal. We are now reading our scriptures with a literalism that is unparalleled in the history of religion. It is a complete aberration. And Philo said, you cannot read these texts literally. They're an upgraded ascent from the body of the physical text, the plain text. You move to an allegorical sense, a moral sense, and finally a mystical sense, which the biblical writer wouldn't have thought of. So this was the beginning, and it was a great wave of scriptures produced. There was the Mishnah and the two Talmuds in the Jewish world, the New Testament in the Christian world, Manichaean scriptures, and finally the Quran, the most perhaps assertive form of scripture when the genre had been fully worked out. Now, Jesus began as an opponent of the Roman Empire. Paul was also very critical of Rome. But then you have the anomaly of Constantine, a Roman Christian emperor. He became sole Roman emperor. His plan was to conquer the world. He moved his capital from Rome to the new city of Constantinople, now Istanbul, and his aim was to conquer Iran. That was the last year of his life. He was planning yet another campaign against Iran, the epicenter of the region, Iran. We're seeing that today. Iran is the natural leader has always been the natural leader of the region, and we see it on the rise again today. Now, Constantine thought that he and his supporters thought that this was the fulfillment of Jesus' kingdom of God. He would conquer the world for Christ. This was what Jesus had predicted when he said, "Preach to all the nations; everyone will come in." He saw himself as enshrining the divine. And we need to beware of polities that think that they are the last word. We've seen some of them in the 20th century with similar massive claims, the Soviet Union, the Nazi regime, and we must beware that any of our state systems are flawed. None of them are going to measure up. Once you start deifying him in that way, you're in problems. He wanted to use Christianity as a force that would unify this vast empire. And it should have worked. Christians believed in brotherly love, after all. But what did he find? Problems in Egypt with the so-called Christological heresies. Started off in Alexandria, where Arius, a presbyter, had some ideas about Jesus, who he was, that clashed with that of his bishop, Alexander, bishop of Alexandria. We've never really understood these disputes in the West. Gibbon was very rude about them. But they were discussing very important things. They were discussing not minutiae of theology and about the nature of God. It was more a question of who are human beings. The divine they saw Jesus, the divine in a human being. Are we, therefore, divine too? And these debates they were very important. They could have been conducted in an amicable, quiet way, which is the only way to approach these very difficult, abstruse, and fascinating matters that are not easily definable, but they were swept up in politics. A lot of the people who were promoting these ideas were ambitious clerics who suddenly, with Constantine, had a chance to sort of blossom politically, and they were using this. People like Athanasius, whose creed we cited, who would go into the Arian churches with the imperial guard and to disrupt their services with people getting killed. This is an absolute anomaly compared with what Jesus was about. But the contemporary theologians, the contemporary historians said there was no theological problems at stake at all in these. They were fired up by politics, newfound politics. Another interesting development in Egypt was monasticism. Again, in part, a response to empire, to the new imperial Christianity, which many felt as a complete oxymoron. It starts with Antony going from Egypt out into the desert, living a solitary life. We got Antony rather wrong, I think. We tended to think of his great temptations by the devils as sexual temptations, but in 4th century Egypt, they weren't quite as obsessed with sex as we are. They were more interested in questions of hunger, poverty, and wealth, the problem of property and wealth. And it was a new kind of, the monks became a new kind of aristocracy, one that challenged the aristocracy of the Romans. Instead of violence, these monks eschewed anger. They were far more concerned about the demon of anger than the demon of sex. These monks worked for their living, unlike the aristocrats of the Roman Empire. When they had a surplus, they gave it to the poor. And they lived together in poverty and created equality among them. It was a long-standing challenge to the aristocracy of Rome. But monasticism is a difficult thing to do. I tried it myself as a young woman and failed completely. Not many people can live totally celibate, totally poor, totally obedient lives or of great austerity. And a lot of monks who were not up to it turned, instead of trying to damp down their anger, gave their anger full rein. And interestingly, they turned it against the temples of paganism. One monk who had been this is mostly not in Egypt so much, but in Syria. Interestingly, we think of what is happening today with the destruction of sacred iconic buildings and statues. One monk who left his monastery, the first thing he did after going into the desert in solitude to pray for 7 years was attack a pagan temple. And the Roman emperors, Theodosius I, decided to harness all this, and he gave the monks free rein, and they went across tearing down pagan temples. In fact, it's been said that the Christianization of Rome happened largely because there were no temples to worship in. And in Alexandria, too, the time of Theodosius I, the imperial guard attacked the temple, the great temple of Serapis, and this caused a major grief and distress throughout the Roman world. It was the It reminds us that part of that came from the brief reign of the Emperor Julian, known as the Apostate, 361 to 363, who tried to revert to the old paganism and gave the wink to people to attack Christian buildings. After he died, after he was killed in an expedition to Iran, to try to conquer Iran, and a Christian was elected in his stead. The Christians said, never again. And some of the monks then began to attack the Jewish synagogues as well as church temples. The one bad thing that the emperors did was a complete break with the past. The Christological heresies were going on, and they stuck to the definition made at the Council of Chalcedon, which we still stick to in the West. The rest of the Eastern Church, however, had never seen Chalcedon as more than a sort of time out, a break from hostilities. Let's just cool it for a while. And they went on discussing these issues until the 7th century. But the emperors insisted that all their subjects embrace Chalcedonian Christianity, and they gave Jews and pagans, Heraclitus gave Jews and pagans a time limit to get baptized. This was atrocious, because in the pre-modern period, it had never been expected that the ruling class and the mass of the people would have the same religion. It was just not, the ruling class lived in such a different kind of way that the idea that they would have nothing in common with the religious ideas of the people. So to impose it in this way was seen as outrageous. So when Islam came along and defeated Persia and Byzantium, the great powers of the region, and reinstated the old Persian system of Islam as the religion of the ruling class, the tiny little Muslim ruling class, and Jews, Christians, Muslims, Zoroastrians, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians rather would manage their own affairs and have autonomy and be free to practice their faith. Everybody breathed a sigh of relief. Now, Islam, we see it today as a violent religion of the sword, addicted to jihad. People are always telling me that Muslims, it's just in their genes, in their blood. They cannot get jihad out of their system. In fact, the word jihad and its derivatives occurs only about 47 times in the Quran. And in only 10 of those instances does it refer unequivocally to warfare. The word jihad, it means effort and struggle. And in the Quran, it's a struggle sometimes to give food to people when you don't have much yourself. That's a struggle, and that is jihad. Military historians have pointed out that Muhammad and the caliphs are some of the few empire builders who managed to build their empires mostly with diplomacy rather than by the sword. But they created an empire. That, again, was one of those anomalies, because just like Constantine, the Quran calls for justice and equality. That is what the Quran is about. That it's wrong to build a private fortune, good to share your wealth equally, to create a just society where poor and vulnerable people are treated with respect. So now they're an empire, and they've got an aristocracy. And this causes huge distress among Muslims. And the Shia developed at that time, saying and eventually deciding that they would withhold themselves from government because all government was essentially corrupt, including mainstream Islamic society. But everybody else was delighted, especially the subject peoples, because they were allowed to practice their religion freely. On the front, they went on as good empire builders, expanding their empire. And the hadith, the traditions about the Prophet, which you hear that sound so murderous and that are constantly quoted, about the Quran, about jihad being the monasticism of Islam, and that the Prophet being sent to God with a sword, and all this talk about virgins, the 72 virgins in heaven, these are the daydreams of the people, of the soldiers at the front, who were campaigning long and hard, months and months, years away from home, away from their wives, who really resented the way the people back home were benefiting from their conquests and hardships. You have to see them as soldiers' dreams. Way back behind the frontiers, you have quite a different, people develop a different view of jihad. In the 9th century, you have a great hadith which has the Prophet saying on coming back from a battle, we're returning from the lesser jihad, the battle, and going back to the greater jihad, which is the attempt to reform your own society and your own heart. And that they are trying to counterbalance the militant hadith of the frontiers. Now, we finish this exhibition in 1171. And just shortly before that, Egypt got a new governor. The ruler of Egypt gave a plea to Nur ad-Din, the Sultan in Palestine, asking for his help against the Crusaders. Now, you've seen in the exhibition how Egypt was affected by the Crusades. People had to take a different route when they wanted to go on pilgrimage to Mecca. If Muslims were really as addicted to jihad as many Western people would have us believe, you would expect them to have been much more militant about the First Crusade. In 1099, the First Crusaders fell on Jerusalem, the third holiest city in the Muslim world, and massacred the entire population of Jews and Muslims there. The blood was said to come up to the knees of the horses. The chroniclers said that 30,000 people were killed in 2 days. You always had to take numbers with a pinch of salt in the ancient world. But certainly, 5 months later, the Crusaders hadn't managed to bury all the bodies. They'd reduced this thriving city into a stinking charnel house. Now, you'd expect the Muslim riposte to have been ferocious. This is the third holiest city in the Muslim world. Not a bit of it. The Crusaders established various states, our first Western colonies, and the local emirs went on fighting one another as usual for land and territory and booty, and they made treaties with the Franks and fought one another with the Franks alongside them. 50 years later, they were still coexisting with the Franks. And it was not until the Second Crusade arrived, more people coming from the West, they thought these people have got to go. And Nur ad-Din begins to try and summon the people to a holy war. It takes but he never succeeds. For 20 years he fights, and he still cannot get the Muslim world together to fight the Crusaders. The new governor in 1168, who comes to the aid of the beleaguered Egyptians who were being fought by the Crusaders, he was very reluctant. He hated warfare. He'd been absolutely traumatized by the campaign. He was a Kurd. His uncle was a great general, and his uncle said, "You're going." In Egypt, he had an awakening. Yusuf, his name was Yusuf al-Ayyub. We usually know him by his honorific title, Saladin. And it took him another 20 years before he managed to incite the Muslim world to get rid of the Franks and to liberate Jerusalem in 1187. And when he arrives in Jerusalem, having defeated the crusading army up in Galilee, there are only non-combatants and women in the city of Jerusalem. And an envoy is sent. He said, and Saladin says, "We will treat you as you treated us in 1099. We will kill you all." And the envoy says, "Oh, please don't." And Saladin says, "Okay," and brokers them. In fact, he's castigated by the chroniclers, who say it was a great military mistake, because he gave them all lifts to go to Akka down the road. This, where the Crusaders had established an outpost, and it took the Muslims another 200 years to get rid of them. My point is that this is not a jihad that is killing civilians, was my point. And the jihad in the region was dead, as stone cold dead, and it had been revived as the result of a sustained assault from the West. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. I'm sure some of you will be poised with questions. Can you raise your hand if you'd like to ask Karen a question regarding her lecture?
Yes.
One question in the front.
Hi, thank you. You talked about the allegorical texts that have a mystical inclination. And I was just thinking, looking at the Christian faith, that perhaps, after the Council of Nicaea, that a lot of these texts were obliterated or obscured from general public view. Is that correct? Is it post-Council of Nicaea that...
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about. It's said that the canon of the New Testament was decided at Nicaea.
Right.
And some books were discarded. In fact, the canon wasn't completed until the 5th or 6th centuries. They went on. You have to have a canon. And what I like about biblical criticism, and this applies to the Hebrew scriptures as well as the New Testament, that it encourages every voice to be heard. There are 4 Gospels, each with a very different take on Jesus, not one. Similarly, in the Torah, you have a lot of that's what makes these texts so contradictory. But there has to be, and some of the texts that were a bit on the wild and woolly side. They took a while to decide which were the ones, and it wasn't all decided at Nicaea, no.
Thanks. Any other questions?
There's one at the back.
I was interested in what you were saying about the status of the Torah in early Judaism. Could you say a bit more about sort of what the early Jews thought about the Torah and when it became sort of what it is now to them, in a sense?
You see how the Torah developed over time. The earliest texts seem to come from the 8th century BCE, and other texts are added. And again, you have the same principle that different traditions seem to have been imported side by side. But whether they had in the 8th century any religious standing, we don't know. Not many people. There was a literary revolution in the 8th century BC in the region, and kings wanted chronicles of their reign, and so these ancient texts were included, were brought together, but then added to, and people felt quite free later to put in traditions that contradicted other ones that they included. So you have different priestly layers where the priests actually disagree with one another. You've got 2 versions of the book of Genesis, for example. And certainly people were quoting Torah, and there was a scriptural faction in Judaism as the years went on, but still, if you look at the intertestamental period, and you have a whole lot of apocryphal scriptures and visionary texts, and some of them are very critical of Torah. Some of them say we need a new one, or that this isn't working, etc. Others love the Torah. Then you have the shock of the loss of the temple, and you have this extraordinary, it is a most extraordinary exegetical feat by the rabbis who take these texts. And they're very interesting about the violence, for example. They turn Joshua and David into learned Torah scholars, saying they had really no interest in warfare at all. The idea was because they said there's been too much chauvinist violence, we've got somehow to tame this. And they were able to hold Jewish political activism at a time when Judaism was very vulnerable in check by this exegesis. And that as I said, every single time a Jew confronts the sacred text, it will mean something different, because the word of God is infinite and it cannot be confined to a single interpretation. In some versions of Talmud, which is a reflection on the Mishnah, which is a reflection on the Torah, moving away from the texts gradually. You don't read, in Judaism, you don't read the Torah without Talmud or Mishnah. And similarly, you would never read until in the pre-modern period, you would never read the Quran by itself. You would always read it through the lens of interpretations which grow up and change over time. There's in the Catholic world, I was taught to read my Bible as a Catholic child growing up in the 1950s in Origen's way, in a sort of this allegorical way. And the word evolution never figured as a problem at all for me. And once you start taking these texts literally, you get into real trouble, because as Origen pointed out, they're different. Each text contradicts one another. And so that has been a major problem. But the Jews said that you don't leave your exegesis until you've brought something, that practical ruling that your community needs at this moment. The Word of God is infinite. It can't be tied down to a single interpretation. It's a process of invention. And the word invention, of course, comes from invenio, which means to find, just as midrash comes from the Hebrew darash, which means to investigate, to go in search of. In other words, the answers aren't going to be there. You have to use your creativity and ingenuity to make them speak to you here and now.
Any other questions? There's one down here. Lots of hands suddenly appeared. Right, where should we start? This lady here on the front row, I think, had hers first. Not in the front row, this row.
I was really interested in what you said about religious freedom and tolerance under these Islamic empires. And was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that.
Sure.
And also perhaps...
I'm glad you asked that, because I had to sort of rush through that bit. The Quran, in 7th century Arabia, there was no concept of exclusive religion, an exclusive religion. No concept of it at all. They saw Judaism as perfectly compatible with their paganism, and there were Jews in Arabia who took full part in Arabian life. And Christians made the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca alongside the pagan Arabs before the coming of Islam. And the Quran is offended by the idea of a religion which, it says, Jews and Christians, are you crazy? You say you've got to be a Jew or you've got to be a Christian. What about Abraham? He was neither a Jew or a Christian. He lived before the Torah and the Gospel. So they're puzzled by this. There's a wonderful saying in the Quran where God speaks firmly to Muhammad, who's distressed that people aren't joining his ummah, his religious community. And God says to him, look, if it had been our will to make you all one single ummah, we would have done so. But it was not our will. In other words, pluralism is God's will. Plus, you have wonderful, this Surah Al-Nur, Surah of Light, which says God is the light of the world. But that light cannot be confined to any one lamp. All have this lamp. And, you know, these are seen as the different religious traditions. Now, a good example of how this worked was when the Muslims conquered Jerusalem in 638. And the Caliph Omar, the second caliph, he came in, well, the Byzantines were all in their glorious glittering robes. Omar came in his camel skin and riding on a camel and looking very much more like Jesus, actually, than the Byzantines. He was shown around Jerusalem. When it came, he was in the Holy Sepulchre Church by the tomb of Christ when the time for prayer came round, and they said, for Muslim prayer, and they said, no, please pray here. And he said no, and he went out and prayed in the public street. And he said, you see, if I had prayed in this church, some misguided Muslims would come after me and knock this church down and build a mosque to create the first Islamic prayer, to celebrate this first Islamic prayer in Jerusalem. And he signed a charter there and then saying that the Christians must keep their churches intact. And then he said, I want to see the temple, because the Quran talks about the great mosque that the Prophet Solomon had built in Jerusalem. And they called Jerusalem Beit al-Maqdis, the city of the temple. We say, where's the temple? Well, it was a bit embarrassing because the Christians had left the temple in ruins, in the ruined state that the Romans had left it in 70. It was just a dump, and with ruins. And in the recent years, they'd used it as the city garbage dump. They tried to palm off a few other buildings as the temple, but Omar wasn't having it. So eventually they took him up to the temple, and he was horrified. He immediately starts clearing it up. He invites, in Christian Jerusalem, Jews had not been allowed to reside permanently in the city. They were allowed to visit it once a year on the 9th of Av, which commemorated the loss of the destruction of the temple. Otherwise, they were not allowed to live permanently in the city. Omar invited them back. They said they must come back to the city of the prophet David. And 70 families came from Tiberias in Galilee to settle in Jerusalem, and they lived in the hottest part of town at the foot of the Haram hotel, the Haram, which was just created. In the 7th century, you find some Jews saying that the Muslims were the precursors of the Messiah because they had prepared the way for the Jews. By this time thought that no Jews must build a temple. The Messiah would rebuild the temple when he came. And they had, by clearing the site, they had prepared the way for the Messiah. The Sufis, who have taken this very seriously and were, until the 19th century, the dominant form of Islam among the ordinary people. They're the mystics of Islam. Not many people can be mystics, but the Sufi devotions, Sufi attitudes were percolated through to the people. It's common for a Sufi to cry in ecstasy that he's neither a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim. He's at home equally in a synagogue, a mosque, a temple, or a church. Because when you glimpse the divine, these man-made distinctions fall away. They're not important. And I've just perhaps finished now with this quotation from Ibn Arabi, which made a huge difference to me when I encountered it at the beginning of my studies. His 12th, 13th century. Do not praise your own faith so exclusively that you disbelieve all the rest. If you do this, you will miss much good. Nay, you'll fail to appreciate the real truth of the matter. God, the omnipresent and omniscient, cannot be confined to any one creed. For he says in the Quran, Wheresoever ye turn, there is the face of Allah. Everybody praises what he knows. His God is his own creature, and in praising it, he praises himself. Consequently, he blames the beliefs of others, which he would not do if he were just, but his dislike is based on ignorance.